Welcome, everyone. I think that most of you know of our guest today, Marilyn Adams, through her book, Beginning to Read. But I should tell you that Marilyn is a psycholinguist and a developmental psychologist. She graduated from Brown. She was a student of Peter Imus, who was a colleague of the Liebermans, who were extremely famous, especially in the 1970s, for their work on the notion of phonemic awareness, the awareness of phonological structure of the language. Marilyn is known not only for her books on reading, especially the beginning reading book, but she's a sought-after consultant on a variety of other projects. She's been a consultant on the National Assessment of Educational Progress, which is the most important evaluative device used in the United States, and we have our equivalent of it here. She was a consultant on Sesame Street, a consultant on many publishers on children's language and literacy. She's worked in information technology and computer science, especially through her connections with Bolt, Beranek, and Newman, the think tank associated with MIT and Cambridge. And I looked up her degree of celebrity to find that she's considered one of the 5 most influential people in the field of reading and reading psychology. And the question that came to my mind was, who in the world would the other 4 be? Anyway, we consider it an honor to have you here, Marilyn, and we look forward to hearing your talk.
Good midweek afternoon. It's so nice for you guys to come here. Thank you very much. And what I'm going to do today is something I think a little inappropriate for a university seminar. I am going to tell you a story. It's a story about the olden days of reading and writing. And for me, this story began quite by accident. I was, I was sitting around, and I'm supposed to stand at the mic, I'm sorry. Remind me if I wander away again. I was called by a very fancy high-tech foundation in the United States and asked if I would please write a report on technology and early language and literacy. And it sounded like a very short report, so I said sure. And then they sent me the paperwork, and it turned out what they really wanted was technology and oral literacy for young children. Now, that's a little weird. I mean, I know what oral literacy is in ethnography, right? It's about the oral tradition, but I didn't know what it was for 3-year-olds. So I asked, and do you guys know? Are you guys awake out there? You have to be awake because I depend on it. Okay, so here's the basic answer from Mark Prensky. Once all books are recorded, the web reads itself, and every child and adult has a text scanner in his or her cell phone that can read any printed text aloud. Should we then still spend all those years teaching kids phonics? Those who continue to teach kids things they need to know only when the technology breaks down are doing those kids an enormous disservice. And this was serious. Reading and writing were obsolete. Now, this was a very fancy foundation full of very rich techies. And I've learned since that this is a very with it, hot attitude. Reading is gone. So, I thought, well, I don't really like this. I don't really buy it. But on the other hand, I have to admit that I've kind of spent a whole lot of time studying reading and writing. And if I was just whiling away my time, I would have chosen something besides phonics. As a obsession, you know. And also I realized that I was biased, that I really saw education through literacy, and I wasn't really qualified to ask this question fairly. And so I dug into the literature to try to prove myself wrong. And among the strands that I got into was the history of reading and writing. And the story I'm going to tell you about today is some of what I learned from that journey. Fair enough? Thank you. Okay, so this is my advance organizer, your advance organizer. Literacy, these are my lessons. This is what I think I learned, biased though I was. Literacy is the process and product of gaining conscious, reflective awareness of our knowledge, our thought, and our language. And developmental progress and requirements follow much the same path as historical inventions and progress. That's pretty cool, huh? And I have to say that I'm sharing this story with you partly because it bears on the question of technology and reading, which I think is something that all of us need to think seriously and proactively about. Because there are good ways to use technology, and there may be destructive ways to use technology. We don't want to find ourselves having decided on less good ways, right? I mean, the electronic babysitter will find its way into our classrooms. Let's make sure it's doing a good job. But the other issue is that I think it turns out to be a good story about why we teach what we do and why it's difficult. So, you ready? All right, so this is a cave painting, a petroglyph. It's especially pretty. I don't know if you can see it with the contrast, but petroglyphs have been found dating back at least 60,000 years, they say now. So as long as there are earliest human artifacts in some sense. And, you know, for sure, it's hard to know exactly when a picture is an artistic expression or a design versus some sort of messaging or record keeping. Even so, people seem to be drawing pictures for a long time before they began to use graphics or messaging or for recording information. The oldest attested, which means people sort of agree, examples of using pictures for messaging or recording information date back only to 6,000 years ago. So that's a big difference. That's 450 centuries, right? That's a long time. Kids would figure this out without us, but it would take a while. Okay, so the point is that for humans, visual depiction seems to be natural, compelling, forthcoming, but reading and writing are not. So here are some examples of some of those early graphics that people generally agree were meant for communication or recording. As you can see, they're a little bit different. There's something systematic about them, something less artsy. So the idea of using pictures for information to represent meaning directly is the way it shows up in the original records, okay? And there's something, it depended on a huge collective mind shift. Even still, this idea of using pictures to represent meaning seems straightforward, right? A sheep represents a sheep. I can do that, right? And it's extendable and transparently so. So, for example, how many? Thank you, class. 3 sheep. Ooh, fancy. I'm not that advanced yet. But if this was 1 sheep, then this one's 3 sheep in my system. All right? And if that's so, then how many?
7.
So it's like infinitely extendable, right? How many? Okay, so there are certain limitations, right? Anybody have the answer? And in fact, archaeologists suggest that writing, that is using writing and I'll come back to what writing is, began with accountants in city-states specifically, where they needed a more efficient way to represent quantities, right? And it began specifically with numbers. The first symbols to represent language were symbols to represent numbers. So here we are. We now have gone from cave paintings in 50,000 BC to pictograms, or using symbols to represent meaning directly, 6,000 BC. 3,000 years more, and we see the emergence of using pictures to represent language, using pictures to represent words and numbers, okay? This is what the formal meaning of writing is, when graphics represent language as opposed to meaning directly. So this was a huge breakthrough. It did take a long time. So here's some examples. The deal is that, you know, Mary's sheep and my herd of sheep and the sheep at the market and counting sheep, if you drew a picture of each of those, they could all look very different, right? And in fact, they did. When we look back at the old text, we see that people used different pictures for the same word if it was a different scene or a different person's things, whatever. But in fact, the word sheep is the word sheep, right? So Mary's sheep, counting sheep, herding sheep, whatever. So this was very handy. It was much more efficient. I'm going to give you some examples. So this first one, instead of having a picture of 3 sheep, we have, right? 3 sheep. And the one to its right, 9 sheep. And then underneath?
Shearing.
Yeah, shearing sheep, good, or wool. And the next one? Yeah, I mean, you know, you have to get a system. There's still some agreement involved. But, you know, you can do this. It's better than having to, you know, draw really well. So this was a really good thing. And we can look at it also in terms of insights. So if our big insight is that literacy is a process and product of gaining conscious, reflective awareness of our knowledge, then first we have this, that we can use pictures as symbols for meaning instead of just decorating, right? We can use them to communicate. Second is that we can use them to represent language, and there's an efficiency there too, because every sheep doesn't look different, it's just sheep. It turns out, what's interesting is how kids' literacy seems to progress in terms of these same sorts of inclinations and insights. So visual depiction comes early, and with great glee often. But again, it's not always easy to tell when artwork is art versus a story or a message. But it seems to be the case, as David has written, David Olson, that children are inclined to have graphics represent meaning directly. Using symbols instead to represent language is something in general that one must learn culturally. So here's a demonstration from Dr. Olson. He was working with little ones, and he said, okay, so what does this say? Little finger point reading, you know, point to each one, 3 little pigs. Okay, I'll point, you read it, 3 little pigs. We do this a lot, right? So then, he covered up one of the words and said, okay, so now what does it say? Now what does it say? What's it say?
3
little pigs. So you guys are at Toronto, so you know this wonderful story so well. Good work, David. The supposition, again, is that visual symbols represent meaning directly. So here's another one that says, do you know this story from Karpova? Okay, he was a student of Vygotsky, and he worked on the same problem he trained the kids to count things. He started with very concrete things, little toy animals. So there was a cow and a horse and a dog and a cat, and he would say, cow, horse, dog, cat, how many? Right? And he worked on that until they were perfect, and then he just kept making it a little bit more abstract with colored blocks, red, blue, green, black. And finally, he got him up to lists of words, and the kids were very, very good at it. They got this task. So, for example, I'm going to give it to you. Listen carefully. Red, green, blue, yellow, orange, pink. How many?
6.
Yay! Okay, another one. Mary and John went walking. How many? Mary went walking and John went walking. There are two. Language is like a glass. The kids were looking for units of meaning. That's the natural way to interpret language. Once we've understood it, we don't need the words anymore. They're gone, right? Okay, so what rises to consciousness is meanings, not words. All right, so symbols for words, that worked out pretty well. And then it turns out that lots of things are hard to draw pictures of. So, for example, proper names are hard to draw pictures of, foreign words. And what people began to do in order to record this information was to use rebuses. So to record Mary Sunberg, they would use a picture of a sun and a picture of a bird, right? The rebus principle, just like those games you play, little kids. So this was another very important insight. And it didn't take that much longer to come after they began using words to represent language, right? It only took, look at this, just 2 centuries, 200 years, drop in the bucket, right? And similarly, what we find is that it does not take that long for kids, once they've learned to think about words, to gain rhyme awareness and syllable awareness, right? How many of you work with little ones? Yeah. So this is fun. This is preschool, right? However, it does take a while. It's much harder than rhymes and syllables to give them the alphabetic principle. Awareness of phonemes is much harder. And interestingly, historically, phonemes also look at 2 millennia for the phonemes to come up after they were doing their rhyme and syllable awareness. So this is fun. This thing on the left is the Norris stele. It's from 1000 BC. It's Phoenician, and I want you to look at the beautiful characters. And the thing on the right is actually contemporary. It's from a little one, but you know, there's a certain similarity there, is there not? Okay, and again, it's just consonants principally. So the top one says, my family went swimming. And this one says, my dad helped me with my bicycle, right? Tricycle, excuse me. He pushed me, he let me do it. Oh, I'm sorry. He pushed me, he let me do it by myself. I did it. Look at those consonants, look at those uppercase letters. Isn't that interesting? Okay, so, you know, the consonants are noticed before vowels. Or at least systematized, makes good sense. I mean, vowels make noise, so the kids are into vowels before they gain phonemic awareness often. But once this phonemic awareness thing begins to set in, the consonants dominate. And if you think about it, consonants are things you do with your mouth, whereas vowels are only the shape of your mouth while you're making the consonants. So they're special. But it was the Greeks who first started representing the vowel phonemes. And the story is that they had borrowed the Phoenician alphabet, the consonant-only alphabet, which included some consonants that they did not need. They did not have consonantal sounds for those letters. And so they repurposed them as vowels because their letter for words like alphabet did need them. They had words like, you know, bug and big, where they needed the vowel distinction. And this was huge. This was the invention of the alphabet. It gave people an unambiguous verbatim record of language, no fill in the blanks. The utterance was complete. It was, in Deringer's words, the creation of a revolutionary writing, a script which we can perhaps term democratic, or rather a people's script, as against the theocratic scripts that had preceded it. The scribes in Egypt were the best paid people in the country. Reading and writing was hard with thousands of symbols for syllables. There were 6,000 symbols at least in the Sumerian syllabary, but 26 letters or 24 or whatever it was back then. And it really hasn't changed very much since then. This is like Here I have the Phoenician and the Greek and the Roman alphabets, and as you see, the characters have changed very little, and the letter sounds have changed very little since assigned by the Greeks. It is believed that the alphabet was invented only once over all times and places, and has pretty much stayed the same. So this is a good thing, right? Kind of interesting? A little bit? You knew it already. Okay. So here we are. We're up to ancient Rome. We're around the 2nd century BC. The Romans took over Greece. They were enamored by lots of Greek things, including their writing system. So they took over the Greek writing system, and it became pretty common. Education was given high priority within the Roman civilization. Children were sent to school, were expected to attend school for 3 years, during which time they learned their letters, they learned their letter sounds, they learned phonemic awareness, they learned decoding and writing, right? Primary grade school works, right? So this sounds very familiar too, but still, reading was appreciated as very difficult. And it's estimated now that even given schooling, few in ancient Rome, fewer than 10%, could read more than isolated words or simple lists. Makes reading first sound pretty good, huh? So the question is, why not? Why, with this people's script, this democratic script? But let's go through our insights. We've now added letters representing phonemes, which has given us this full thing. And let's lend some time to what's hard, what's involved in learning about the letters, those 24 or 26 little symbols. And for this, I'm going to share some data that I collected with a group in California called the California Reading Literature Project, which is a consortium of teachers across the state. And these are data that we collected on how many of their kindergartners knew their ABCs when they came into kindergarten. These are all poor kids. Some of them are free lunch. All of them are below median in income. As you see, typically when you measure entry-level letters, you get a U-shaped curve. The kids know either all the letters or none of the letters, and the rest are in transition. What you find is that for the very poor kids, it looks like a backwards J, and for the less poor kids, it looks like a J. They know a few more modally than the very poor kids. So, but with these data in hand, the teachers worked very, very, very hard at making sure every child would leave kindergarten knowing their letters. Good idea, right? All right, and they were fabulous. Virtually every kid knew virtually all of their letters. Is that good? Okay, so we love this. So now let's go to the end of first grade. Same kids, same teachers. This is about 5,000 kids, so it's a lot of kids, right? 5,000 is many. All right, even here. Okay, so what this chart shows, on the bottom is a measure of phonemic awareness, and on the side is a measure of, it results from a decoding test, from being able to read novel words. And what you see is, from the slopes of the curves, that the better the children's phonemic awareness was when they entered kindergarten, the better their phonics was when they left first grade 2 years later. Right? So all these data still work. We've all learned about this. But the big difference here is the distance between these three lines. The children who knew most of their letters in kindergarten are infinitely better off than the children who knew very few, even though virtually all these children learned all of them perfectly by the end of the year. Okay? It's not whether you know them accurately, it's how well you know them. The letters, I mean, think about it. Letters look more like, they all rhyme with each other, right? B, C, D, P. And they look more like each other than anything else the child's been asked to learn about, except maybe numbers, which he's learning at the same time. And there's more to learn about the letters than just how they look. So here's spelling at the end of first grade, again 2 years later. And you see the same thing. Knowing those letters early and well really makes a difference. So all right. So let's talk about phonemic awareness. As you probably are, as some of you I know, researchers fight continually about which is more important, the ABCs or phonemic awareness. And the reason they fight is that no matter how you measure it, the kids who have phonemic awareness also have letter knowledge. But there are kids who have learned their letters who don't have any PA. Okay, so there is a distinction in there that puts your antennae up. So let's see why. These are data from my friend Joe Torgeson, and these are data that he collected while developing his phonemic awareness test way back when. And what you see is he measured entry-level phonemic awareness for first graders, and these are collapsed into the kids who are above average and below average on his test. And what you see is at beginning of first grade, there was a little bit of difference, but mostly they were 6-year-olds, and they all seemed fine. And then as you trace them across time, what you see is the kids who kind of got it grew. By 5th grade, their word reading was at 5th grade level. The other kids' word recognition was stuck at the 3rd grade level. Reading comprehension, the kids who were above average in phonemic awareness were now well above grade level. The other kids were stuck at the 3rd grade level. So you guys have, I hate to do this to you, but there's somebody in here who hasn't had this done to them, so forgive me, the rest of you. Phonemic awareness is the insight, or magic word, insight, that every spoken word can be conceived as a sequence of phonemes, right? Where phonemes are the units of speech that correspond to the letters of an alphabet, right? Phonemic awareness, because phonemes, the letters of the alphabet represent phonemes, it's necessary for learning to read and write in alphabetic language. And the first step is often held to be this sense of phonemic identity, that the M in mommy is the same as the M in moose and milk and my. Here's a little brain science. You guys are all graduate students, so you shouldn't need this either, but always nice to do some 101. Okay, in general, the two sides of the brain, this is very inhibiting, are pretty much the same, with a big exception of language, which is lateralized from birth to the left hemisphere. Okay, so here we are with our nice language area in the what's called the temporal lobe, the one on the side that stretches back to the back. So one of the things that happens as the brain learns to recognize letters, anything you look at visually comes and projects on your like visual projection screen back here. But what it begins to do is it goes, uh-oh, that's a letter. And instead of sending it both sides to do its job, it goes, letters only go this way. If it's a letter, it's going left. And the place that it sends it, it goes, oh, it's a letter. And this doesn't happen. Letters don't begin to be sorted right until basically after that 2nd grade hump, when the kids start to be able to read and think at the same time. Oh, thank you. I have a laser pointer. So you see the pictures, the words, and the pictures being projected onto your slide screen in the back of your head. And the words are black. Oh, you really can't see this very well. Anyway, the words, there are lots of black dots on this one. And there are lots of white dots on both of them. But the letters whether they're individual letters or words, get preferentially sent to the left hemisphere where language is lateralized. It turns out that the spots where these letters get sent, the area of the brain where the letters get sent, is right next to the spot, laser, don't push the wrong button, is right next to the spot where we process phonemes, this language lateralization, right next to it. And look what happens. What happens is that seeing a letter turns on phonemes, and hearing phonemes turns on letters. So in a sense, for the brain, what happens is functionally recognizing a letter This is exactly the same as turning on its phoneme. They're one and the same. So we can argue about which is more important, but they are, they're chicken and egg, right? It's not or. But again, this doesn't begin to happen until the kids begin to gain automaticity. All right, so now we're down to phonemic awareness in letters, which is great because it gives us phonics, and it gives us decoding, and it gives us spelling. And we also can look at it in terms of our I have too many buttons here, of our word timeline. And again, once we got that phonemic insight, it was a matter of luck that we got the vowels so quickly, right? They were harder. But we still have this issue that even where people were well schooled in the alphabetic basics, very few could read. So the question is, why was reading so hard? I mean, Rudolf Flesch said, what has happened throughout history? I taught them the letters, I taught them the sounds, and then they could read any book I put before them, right? So why was reading so hard? So let's look at that. Here's one issue. This is a nice ancient Greek manuscript. Anybody see anything a little challenging about it? No spaces. No punctuation. All uppercase letters. It just kind of looks like a lot of letters, right? And in the casual hand, just so you're clear, it wasn't a lot easier. Here's a ancient Roman manuscript, just so you know that this wasn't strictly a Greek thing. So a question for you who've worked with little kids, when they first start writing, do you see uppercase letters or lowercase letters? There's this big, strong tendency towards uppercase letters, and it turns out or people have done computer analyses and found that these uppercase letters are common with the letters that are first invented in languages around the world, and that they use those basic Hubel and Weasel shape detectors. So they truly are easier for the children to learn perceptually and motorically. The basic curves and the horizontal and vertical bars, they're like 5 shapes that govern them all. Whereas the lowercase letters, by the way, at least for our alphabet, depend on learning to write. They're tied to your motor movements because reflectivity is not something the visual system distinguishes. So if I get a stroke in my motor in my hands, in my hand area of my brain, I can't recognize lowercase letters anymore. Cool? Very cool. Writing is important. Okay, so eventually the lowercase letters did come. As I say, they're harder to recognize, but they were easier mechanically to write. When you had to write a lot of stuff, the flow from one to the other is easier, and they're also easier to distinguish in a big array of letters, as in continuous text. So there was a motivation for them, even though they were harder. And they stayed because of that. But still, the lowercase letters were invented by different people in different places, so there had to be some standardization there. But there were also no spaces, no punctuation, dialectical and language differences all over the place, and everything was spelled through inventive spelling. It's a challenge, right? I mean, even though our kids all speak, we know what language they're writing in, it's sometimes hard to read, right? All right. So, shouldn't this business of upper and lowercase letters be a bad thing? Why didn't we just get rid of the uppercase letters? Because then we had to learn 52 instead of 26 or 24 or whatever. Well, it turns out that once you've learned something, the brain's really kind of good about it. We have this thing called visual normalization. So, for example, here's an example of something written in many different fonts, many different sizes, upper and lowercase. They all say the same thing except one. Can you spot the one that's different? Isn't that remarkably easy?
One on the right.
Oh, huh?
Bottom right.
There it is. Isn't it amazing? And that's because your brain is so smart. It does this wonderful thing for you where it exaggerates It ignores irrelevant variations, and it amplifies relevant differences, even tiny ones, okay? So it exaggerates differences that are relevant and just ignores the ones that aren't. And that's a magical thing about people. It's another reason why you need to learn your alphabet pretty well. Okay, so it turns out that brain imaging studies give us back pictures of how this works. This is a ventral, or from the tummy, bottom picture of the brain. And what you see is this is a little part of the brain, the visual cortex that's there for discriminating things where you need to pay careful attention to visual detail. Okay, and what happened is it turns out that written words got squished in roughly between houses and faces, or tools and faces. Right in, oop. He's going to discipline me in a minute. Right in here, written words. We repurposed a part of this visual cortex for recognizing print. This is true of people who know how to read and write. It doesn't matter how they were taught to read and write. It doesn't matter what language they were taught to read and write. It doesn't matter what the nature of the language is that they were taught to read and write. There's sandwich in here where we've just repurposed a part of the brain. And by the way, by the time this area right here, this little area, is what's called in the literature, if you get into the neurological literature, it's often called the visual word form area, VWFA. And what's interesting is that by the time the letters get to this area, it doesn't matter if they're upper or lowercase. It doesn't matter what font they are. They've already been turned into some kind of a that's just an A. So that part's gone. Pretty cool, huh? God was a very good engineer, whatever else. Okay, so here we go. From ancient Rome through the Middle of the Ages, we're moving up in time, we find that reading aloud acceptably depended on careful memorization and rehearsal of text. We've looked at the manuscripts. We see that they're a little hard. I love this quote from a Roman doctor. Those who have never learned verses by heart and must instead resort to reading them in books sometimes have great pains in eliminating through abundant perspiration the noxious fluids that result. Anybody ever seen one of those kids in their class? So this is reading aloud. You practice the text before you read it. Silent reading was extremely rare. And it was also suspect. I mean, were they hallucinating? What was wrong with these people? There were people who could do it. A few were saints. The rest were heretics. And understanding was to be achieved through listening to a text read aloud. So someone would practice a text until they could deliver it without the noxious fluids, and then they would read it aloud. If you wanted to understand it yourself, you were supposed to, again, practice and then listen to yourself reading aloud, which is why in some cultures when they read their religious text, they're still supposed to read aloud as part of that tradition, so you can hear and understand. So this doesn't make any sense, does it? I mean, how can you possibly read something and be clueless about what it says? So you want to play? I want you to read this aloud with me. We're just going to read the first paragraph, okay? We're all going to read it together. The title is read the title first. Ladle Rotten Hut. Okay. Once upon term. With expression, please. No? Okay, so who wants to tell me what they read? Okay, I'm going to read aloud to you. Once upon a time, there was a little girl who lived to wed her murder and her little cottage on her edge of a large, dark forest. This little girl often wore a little cloak with her putty little red hat, and for this reason, people called her Ladle Rat Rotten Hut. So it could happen, and remember that this was roughly what was happening. Things were represented phonetically and approximately and not conventionally, right? But there were no spaces,
Oh,
right? Or punctuation, right? This was tough. And there wasn't very much to read, so it wasn't that they'd had a lot of practice reading so that it was automatic. Okay, so it is possible to read aloud without understanding. In the 5th through 14th century, people generally did not write, as distinct from copying, which was a profession. Reading was broadly appreciated as extremely difficult. Those who could demonstrate an ability to read or write were exempted from secular authority and death penalty by benefit of clergy. You know, God must have kissed you if you can read and write. This led to a lot of cheating. There was one page, since the judges couldn't read and write, and if you could recite that page, you could get away with, literally, murder. Okay, so it was just hard. And the Scripta Continua, the no spaces and no punctuation, continued, and you kind of go, well, why? And the reason, the basic reason is that people don't like to change when they've learned something. You know, I learned this, I worked hard, I'm good at it, so I don't like to change. But in addition, it didn't need to. Latin was the official language of text throughout Europe. Latin really didn't much need spaces, since the beginnings of and endings of words and syllables were orthographically clear from the vowels and the consonants. They have a simple, relatively simple syllable structure. Phrases and sentences were well demarcated by inflections, grammatical word parts that indicated how they were working together. And also the available texts were kind of few and far between, and you were supposed to memorize them anyway, not a problem, right? When I say most of Europe, I mean most of Europe. There was one country that was sort of an exception, and that was poor little England. England had a very special problem. It did not have this Latin language at heart. English syllables are complex. They not only are CVs and CCVs, but they can end with lots and lots of consonants. You can't just use the presence of a consonant to know where one syllable begins and one syllable ends. Right? This makes it hard, and when you start putting all kinds of words together, you can't just use the consonants to know where one word ends, and there's no inflection on the words. Our grammar is based on word order, the order of the words. John kissed Mary is different from Mary, or John was kissed by Mary, or Mary kissed John. They're different, right? No inflections. And also, English syntax is what is known as stress-timed. This is the famous prosodics that David talks about. So in order to give syntax to the text you're reading, you have to impose it on there. You have to be able to hear it in your mind's eye. You can't, like, work for an hour to take the sentence apart and then do it. It doesn't work that way. And finally, even though Latin, Vulgate Latin, was the first or second language of most Europeans, there were very few in England who spoke Latin. They spoke various versions of English, of which there were many. But really none of these headaches really mattered very much for England, because for all practical purposes, English was not a written language during this time. Latin was the lingua franca of text, the language that people use for corresponding internationally, for writing laws, for writing codas. There was French, which was very close, much closer to Latin then, which was used for literature, and the very lovely people read French literature. And I'm not saying that English technically wasn't a written language. There had been efforts to develop written English that dated back to like the 8th century. But it had fallen into obscurity after the Normans. So Alcuin of York and St. Alfred the Great, both of these men, in fact, were said to be saints, had worked very hard at developing written English. It was still used in the monasteries. It was still, there were still records in the monasteries, but it was not used anymore. Both these men, by the way, are known as saints in many places. They have never been officially canonized because, I think, because England and the Catholic Church have been a bit out of sorts for the last millennium. or so. So then, around the 10th century, 2 centuries, Crusaders began to bring back philosophical and science texts from ancient Greece and Rome that had been preserved by the Islamic cultures. And, this was very exciting. Suddenly there was something more to read. There was something people really wanted to read. People just wanted to get their hands on these texts, but there was a shortage of highly qualified scribes. Suddenly the book market, but they couldn't find enough scribes to do it. So what happened was that they wanted to accelerate the book production activity, especially, this was in Paris, and they hired this guy named Peter Abelard. Peter Abelard had been trained in an Irish monastery with writing English, that included writing English, wicked smart guy. And what he did, he came to Paris to help them with this transcription process so everybody could read Aristotle and whatever. And he said, okay, everybody's going to have to put spaces in between the words when they copy. Because now they were, picking up low-budget scribes in training. And he did this because they were so bad that everything had to be, everything was actually, all the scribal writing, there were wicked systems of quality control, but it was much easier with the spaces between the words. So we asked them to put the spaces in for quality control reasons, but lo and behold, it turned out that these little scribes in training quickly began to learn to read. They began to understand what they were reading, be able to copy off phrases and miracles, right? So this was a really, really good thing. And yes, this is the same Abelard as in the Abelard and Heloise story. You guys know that story, right? Of an opera house. You know that story? He was really, really smart. So Eloise was this really beautiful young lady, and her uncle hired Abelard to tutor her. And he was really smart, and she was really smart, and they were both... Anyway, one thing led to another. And then the uncle found out, and Abelard's offending parts were removed, and he was sent to a monastery, which is why we have all of this wonderful work. Writing in your office, right? Okay, so this guy was wicked smart. No wonder she loved him, right? He distinguished words, parts, from syllables. Previously, there had been no word for word. Interesting? He accorded word status, and this is very important for those of us who speak English, to function words. Perhaps he got that from Alfred, but to and of, instead of being inflections, were words. If you think about that after you leave, you'll realize how important, you'll begin to think about how important it is. He distinguished two major parts of speech, nouns and verbs. And we are really thinking about our language now, right? He distinguished two key parts of a sentence, the subject and the predicate. And he made all kinds of rules for word order and clarity. So I like this quote. It sounds so 20th century. Complex ideas rest not on words taken individually, but on the retention of groups of related words in memory, in which manner general meanings are first extracted and then combined and remembered. Couldn't you have written that in 1987, don't you think? All right. So here we are. We're down to sentence awareness. This is a really cool thing, right? Sentence awareness, subjects and predicates, their topics and comments, right? Okay, so here we are. From the 12th century, after they started getting these spaces, the spaces were necessary for written English, but they were a boon for everyone, and they took off quickly all over Europe. King Louis said you have to use them, and people did. The convention of inserting spaces was adopted quickly. Reading and writing just grew rapidly across Europe, and the study of syllogisms and logic took off. And if you think about this subject and predicate, it's hard to do an Aristotelian syllogism without one, right? And also, I should add that the Italians figured out how to make paper. It turns out paper is really useful for learning to read and write. Those of you who are in kindergartens, you can tell your principals I said so. We're down to, you won't believe this, but we're down to 1 ream of paper per grade in some of our cities. 1 ream of paper, 500 sheets for the kindergarten, for all the teachers for the whole year. Who needs paper more than kindergartners? Really? Okay, so the other thing that Spaces gave us is it gave us words. Words. You remember this little guy, the little visual word form area? Well, this little guy right here, this is really important because it's really, really hard to learn to recognize a word at a glance if words don't exist. Right? Okay, now we're really, really making progress. So reading and writing began to increase enormously, but there was still a little problem. Here's an English document from 1332, and as you see, there's spaces in between the words. It's very nicely copied, but what's missing? Yeah, there's no punctuation. I'm sorry, I can't hear you. Paragraphs? No paragraphs. Really good point. And it turns out those great big uppercase red capital letters have nothing to do with sentences. They're just important words. Okay, so we're working on it. Here's King Arthur. This is like 200 years later, 150 years later, and just to show you that it's the same. This, by the way, is half Latin, and every now and then there's an English proper noun or something sprinkled in, but mostly it's Latin with a few English words now here and there, even though it's an English document. This is at least in English of its time, handwritten, with the same issues. Here we are with the printing press, and mechanical print makes the letters far more legible because they're more regular. I can learn to recognize the letters from one instance to the next. This is the end of Genesis and the beginning of Exodus. What's missing? Well, they have spaces between the words, but there's still no paragraphing. There are no sentences. The red capitals are for important words. It's a mess, right? It's hard. I mean, more noxious fluids, right? Okay, so then there's this guy. Have you heard of this guy? Aldus Manutius. I love this man. Okay. He was a school teacher. And he'd been trying to teach Italian kids to read and write. And he said, this is just really much harder and not as much fun as it could be. So he became a printer only after he retired from teaching and only printed for 15 years. He just had all these ideas inside him about how we could do this to make it better. And with Aldus, began graphic design, new fonts, punctuation, paragraphing, pocketbooks, as in books you put in your pocket. The largest ever print runs affordable books for the people. Isn't that pretty? He did scientific text with explanatory graphics. And he is he and his son are held responsible for paragraphs, commas, periods, semicolons, parentheses, and some other marks that don't survive still. But, I just think, and also look at this. I mean, don't you just want to touch it? He made beautiful books that you just had to have and had to see what the story was. So this goes on our chart. This is awareness of discourse structure and reader needs, right? Spaces took a long time because you know what? Writers don't need spaces. It's readers who need the spaces, right? Your little ones who write, do they put the spaces in? Very often not. But there's more than just the spaces. I'm writing this so someone can read it. How do I organize it? How do I design it with that mind in mind? All right. First printing press in England, 1476, William Caxton. Now, William Caxton was a businessman. He had been printing in Belgium, and he decided he would come back This is not that long after the invention of the printing press, and he would print books in England, and he wanted to print books in English in England. To which the people who he asked to invest said, "What are you, nuts? No one knows how to read English. Why would you print books in English?" And he basically said, "If I print them, they will come." So they did. And in fact, literacy in England, in the 16th century England, is said to have grown, 15th century England is said to have grown more than in any other period in any other place in terms of relative numbers. So a problem, Mr. Caxton, is that he did most of the translation and the printing and the typesetting and the whatever, and he again was a businessman. Right? This was an oral language within which he was working, and he was writing literary books. So many of these words had never been written before, those he'd translated. He had to choose how to translate them to English. He was not a scholar. He was a businessman. And so when he translated a word from this place to that place, it was often spelled differently and often kind of weirdly. I mean, when you think about England's problem, you know, they had been prohibited from writing in English, but there wasn't any reason to believe why it couldn't be done in principle. Every other language used the alphabet. Couldn't England use the alphabet too? You know, it's just another language. And it turns out English is not a Latinate language, so problems did arise. But they didn't appreciate it. It took decades of writing for them to appreciate how much trouble they were in. Okay, so this is one of his first books. You want to read the first paragraph there to yourselves? Go ahead. You can read it in the regular. Yeah, it's a little different, isn't it? Okay, so I'll read it to you. When in April with his showers sweet, the drought of March has pierced the roots and bathed every vein in such liquor of which strength engendered is the flower. You know? And then you can translate it into more modern syntax. But as you see, the spellings were different. And this was Chaucer. Geoffrey Chaucer, it turns out, was kind of an activist, an English writing activist. He got into this thing towards the end of the 1400s of going around and giving shows of King Arthur's tales, and he would tell the story aloud to people to engage them in the legends of England, you know, supporting the oral literacy. But every place he went, he wrote it down. He said it was just a memory crib to help him, but he always left it there. So there was a little insurrection going on about writing English before Caxton got there with his business proposition. So anyway, in England, reading and writing increased dramatically over the next 200 years. It was just remarkable. Schools were put in place, how-to books, smut, cheap sheets, newspapers, everything began to come out, in addition to reading the Bible. But there was still a little problem. You ready? This is typical. I pulled this off the web out of many, many hundreds that I could have chosen. I just chose one. Again, I'd like you to please read this.
Oh my.
That's pretty good. It's kind of confusing, isn't it? It's not that long ago. I will read it to you. Here we go. The 18th day of October was buried Judge Hind in St. Dunstan's Parish in the west with a standard coat. I want you to see if you hear anything familiar. I mean, the spelling's crummy. We know that's a problem. But I want to see if you hear anything else familiar in this as I read it. Was buried Judge Hind in St. Dunstan's Parish in the west with a standard, coat, helmet, sword, and pennon, target, and a herald and judges, 2 and 2 together, and then sergeant of the coif, 2 and 2 together, and clerks singing, and my lady Hind did make another standard and a coat of arms, and a pension and a helmet and target and sword had to be at the month's mind in the country for him, and a great deal of money and of meat and drink and gowns to the poor, and after that there was much ado there for him. Sounds pretty third grade, doesn't it? We could call this a run-on sentence. So it's not just spelling, it's also grammar. Grammar is late to develop in formal written grammar of text is late to develop in children, and it was late to develop historically. Let's do the spelling first, because that was a big deal. It took them a while to realize that they were in trouble, that this wasn't behaving like Italian or French or Spanish, that English was a problem. And meanwhile, over these 200 years, while they were kind of saying it's getting worse, there were more and more words that were getting stuck, because once they'd been printed, that printing was taught to children in school and used in other books. So that was part of the problem. So finally, 1582, 100 years later, this little school teacher, Mulcaster, thought we ought to have a spelling list. And so this is kind of nice, I think. So it's about the first one that I've seen documented. And you can see that he's occasionally indicated that spellings weren't settled by putting parentheses around them, so blasphemy and blasphemy, wasn't sure. But he has put in some conventions, for example, letter doubling, as in bigger and bicker and bickering. And he has put in, there are still a number of differences from modern spellings, like this is bigness with an E on the end. And the words that end in, like bitchery, ends with IE. You know, it's not that we changed the Y to IE before adding S, it's that we changed the IE to Y after we took the S off. Kind of different. But they were working on it. They were understanding that kids, if they were going to develop this reading automaticity, they needed to be able to recognize the words. This word recognition, standardization of spelling, oops, wrong button, is really very important. Oh, come on. Because words are spelled the same time each time we see them, because there are familiar patterns, conventions for spelling syllables and sounds, pronunciations, that's responsible for bigram growth in the mind, for your ability to know that TH is likely and TP is not. It's responsible for your ability to see whole words at a glance. It's responsible for neighbor effects like day, way, pay, say, clay, or cat, fat, bat. And it's responsible for the automaticity of word recognition and spelling. Having a spelling system matters. And this is sort of, as David mentioned, I worked on a computer thing, so I wrote a computer simulation here of why invariant spellings are so important for those of you who wonder if I learned anything computationally sublime at BBN. So there's tick, lick, sick, brick, chick, chicken, thicken, thickness, pickiness, limerick, toothpick, mimicry, unticklish, whatever. There's thousands of them. But what happens literally within your mind is you begin to develop these patterns, so that the reason you acquire decoding automaticity is because it gets to the point with every new word that you see, it's partially or largely learned already. So if it's topical on National Public Radio or something and you read it in the paper, you may not even notice that you've never seen it before, right? Because it maps, and it maps in chunks. This is a model of how it works in the brain, which, crude as it is, seems remarkably representative. So the letters come in as individual separate letters of the word, full and complete, the array. They get bundled into these spelling patterns like ick and syllables, and then they get bundled into morphemes, and then they get pushed into the whole word. So it all gets taken apart, and then it all gets put together. In this little visual word form area, what they see is that the letters come in the back, and as the activation flows from back to front, the letters get bundled into bigrams and into syllables and into words. Pretty cool, huh? This business of being able to peek into people's minds with the various technologies is so much fun. Okay, so spelling. Spelling invariance is very, very important. It gives us visual word recognition. It gives us decoding automaticity. And it also gives us lexical stability, which is a very, very nice thing. So, we don't have any more flutterby butterflies. Without little kids, when they come up with things like skinny pig for guinea pig, or biscotti for spaghetti, those go away when you learn to spell. Although you still see on the blogs gorilla for gorilla, right? But spelling invariance gives us lexical stability, where that's pronunciation stability and also morphemic stability through the spelling stability. So now we're, in addition to spellings, we want these kids to be able, now that they have spellings, to look them up and find the meanings. This was really very important because a huge number of words were imported into English during this period of time. Remember, English was essentially an oral language, but they were trying to translate literature from other countries, and they were trying to write about things that hadn't been written about before. So here's an example. This is now 200 years later after Caxton, of a table alphabetical, this invention of alphabetical order. I cannot exaggerate how important this was. And you had to teach people the concept. You what? Just with the letters? Okay, so this little book, it was supposed to be containing and teaching the true writing and understanding of visually hard, usual English words. So, for example, and it gave a little bit of etymology. So if they're marked with a G, like this one, it means that they came from Greek. Most of them aren't marked with anything. They can also be marked with a L for Latin and with a K for kind. So, for example, an apricot, K is a kind of fruit. That's all. There were only 2,500 words. The definitions were, for example, a center is the middle of any round thing or circle. Chaos is a confused heap of mingle-mangle. These are hard, usual words. Chambering was lightness and wanton behavior in private places. Just the words you need, just the 2,500. Most important, most useful. So, and then finally, this was not that much longer, but it was almost 200 years. And there were committees and committees. You've all read in your old literature about the Philological Society, which was like the smartest guys in the world, and you went, what's that about? The Word Lovers Society? This was hard, trying to figure out what English was. They've been using it forever, but now they had to figure out how to deal with the words. They had to figure out the grammar. Diagramming sentences was like better than Sudoku, figuring out what these pieces were and how it all fit together. This is something they did in the coffee houses. So Samuel Johnson got the task. He wanted the task, and he got the task of writing the dictionary for the Philological Society to fix the language as he saw it. And this is still said to be the greatest dictionary by many that was ever invented. It had 43,000 words. The words were all cited by their usage in context, their earliest usage that he could find. The words were syllabified. The stress of the words was marked, so which syllable was stressed. The part of speech was given. It's all new work, new technology, right? New insights. Numbered senses. So, ball is in Cinderella's ball was different from ball is in football. And the etymology, where it came from. And then the literary quotes illustrating usage and history for each word. So, this was what Samuel Johnson wanted to do. This was his dream job. But I have to say that even for him, even when you get your dream job, there are those days when it's really not as good as you thought it would be. This is his entry. It's in the dictionary. Lexicographer, a writer of dictionaries, a harmless drudge that busies himself in tracing the original and detailing the signification of words. Just stuck in there. Poor little guy. he did this all. This was so astounding. He did it with a staff of 8. It took him, I think, 9 years. 8 years. Staff of 6, and it took him 8 years. By comparison, the French Academy worked for 55 years with a staff of 40. And nobody ever said that was the best dictionary in the world. I mean, this guy was amazing, even if he did sneak some things in on bad days. Okay. So we have this issue with vocabulary. This pressing need for dictionaries really came about with writing. And it wasn't simply that they were seeing words in print that hadn't been in their conversation and needed to look them up, so needed the spelling, but also that they were seeing so many new words. So that it is said that only 10,000 different words account for about 96% of spoken English. That family of words changes from neighborhood to neighborhood. It's different at the University of Toronto than it is in Dallas. But it's about the same regardless of neighborhood. By contrast, the number of words in popular contemporary print, popular, not like science or nature, popular contemporary print is at least 1 million, according to the British National Corpus. Of every 100 words in use in England by the year 1600, 39 were introduced after the year 1500. The vocabulary explodes with writing. 1/3 of all current, that's why people keep saying Shakespeare is such a genius. Once you start thinking about this, you go, oh my gosh. 1/3 of all current words with Latin roots were first used in the century or so following the arrival of the printing press. It's a lot of words, right? And this is an interesting statistic. Conversational levels, those 10,000 words, no matter how fluent and facile you are, no matter how, they limit, if that's your vocabulary, they limit you to a reading level of grade 4 or below. This is really important for those of you who teach. You cannot check a child's functional literate vocabulary by conversing with them because it's a different language. I'm not saying nobody's language speaks the language, nobody's neighborhood speaks the language of text. And our job as teachers is to get these children fluent in the language of text. Does it make sense?
Yes.
All right. So, grammar. Webster, Samuel Johnson wanted to do it, but he was worn out by the time he finished his dictionary. No problem. Daniel Webster said, I'm going to do it because I'm a genius. Cool. He couldn't do it. But there's this little guy named Gould Brown, who is apparently the world's biggest pain, who wrote a grammar book, which is online. You can look at it. You can Google it. It's like Government and Binding. It goes on and on, much of the same language. It's just hilarious, and it's so detailed. This was his calling. And in this thing, he covered orthography, etymology, syntax, prosody, all with engineering-like precision. He went through the whole thing. I really urge you to look at it. It's very impressive. So why is this important? This is important because it's the grammar of written language that affords the complex sentences of written text, that allows us to express complex descriptions and arguments with precision. That is what caused or what was influenced by what happens at the same time, the conditions, the exceptions, the characteristic, and which battle, which molecule. These kinds of expressions are wholly unique to written language. And some forms of text like law and science and mathematics really depend on this very precise grammar. So, when I say that there was a plane in the wind in an algebra problem, it doesn't matter if it's a plane in the wind or a savings account and inflation or riverboat and a current. It really doesn't matter. It's only the grammar that counts, right? This is very different from oral language. So the spoken sentence, and this is from Chafe, basically, that the natural sentence of oral language consists of a single clause or phrase. It's 7 words at most, lasts a couple seconds, and it's syntactically ill-formed by written standards, okay? Whereas in written language, the focus and pragmatics of oral language are signaled principally by prosody, by my inflection and timing. So, for example, I can say he's coming, or he's coming, or he's coming, right? And they all mean different things, even though if I wrote that down, it would say he's coming. Okay? The structure and meaning of oral language is largely supported by context, time, place, gestures, facial expressions, but in written language, I have to make sure that I describe exactly the one I'm talking about and the time and place I'm talking about before I can start telling you what I want to say about it. So, for example, in oral language, you can say things like, it's like the time when, I told you about that thing that Mary, you can't write that down, not even an email. And this is more pervasive than most of us give it credit for. So, for example, in a nice second grade book, nice little second grade Basil, I can write a sentence, perfectly nice sentence, like, the old woman with the red hat gave the flowers to the boy. No problem, right? That's the sentence that would never occur in anybody's oral language, except maybe William F. Buckley, Jr. Instead, you say, so there was this woman, and she was kind of old. She had on a red hat. Anyway, she had these flowers, and she gave them to the boy. Clause by clause by clause. I named the subject. Look at all the things I did there, like the woman versus this woman. In written text, we say a versus the. In oral language, when we want to say, this word I've not used before, but it's going to be topical, I don't use a when I introduce it, I use this. We were at lunch and this woman came over, right? Every clause, what I want to do is I want to name my subject and then I want to stick it with pronouns. I want to use pronouns completely, consistently, to let my listener know that I have not changed the note on which I want him to throw all this information. So, for example, if I can't keep using the pronoun, I cheat. I want to use the pronoun to let my listener know. So if I can't use the pronoun, I cheat. I say, there was this woman, so I start it with an empty pronoun, or I say, this woman, she. I don't change it. I keep that pronoun there until I change where I want you to glue that information. But in written language, we don't do that. We have our subject and our predicate and our subject clause. We have to put all this stuff to make sure that you know what subject I'm talking about, who I'm pointing to as my subject, and the same in the predicate. But I still can only have a subject and a predicate, only a main noun and a main verb. And from that, we get all of these wonderful parts of speech, infinitives and prepositions and embedded clauses and dependent clauses, so that my clause still has just a subject and a predicate. But kids, when they open these books, it just turns into word salad. Reading without the grammar of reading is like doing math without operators. It just doesn't work very well, right? Can you imagine just having numbers without pluses and minuses? It doesn't work. Okay, so with the difference that learning the grammar is natural and easy if you walk them through it, but it's very important, and it had to be systematized for written language without the prosodics and the context. So now we've added awareness of grammatical relations and structure. And did I push the wrong thing? I did, I'm sorry. So 19th century, I'm almost done. 19th century, we got more dictionaries, we got more words, we got the OECD, the Old English Dictionary, Oxford English Dictionary. We got a keener awareness every time we wrote the dictionary of distinctions between meanings and usages. Far more writing, and I'd like to say that the Enlightenment brought with it an awareness of self. People, as they read, as they began to write science, they wanted to know exactly what was observed, exactly what was seen, exactly what the experiment showed. And they also wanted to know what this scientists thought, but they wanted to know the difference between what he saw and what he thought. And so, as David has pointed out in his work, there came, with the Enlightenment writings, the scientific and philosophical writings of the 19th century, a surge of imported words of what can be called speech act or modal epistemic verbs, verbs expressing my certainty about, or my attitude about the information I'm reporting. Textbooks. Textbooks are really boring. Turns out that's a plan. The idea was that textbooks should report just the facts, only the facts, ma'am. No opinion, just the facts. That's why they're so boring. It was a plan. You know, once people realize that there's a difference between what I know and what I think of it, which was a big leap, then it affected our language and it also affected some of our social conventions, right? Cool, huh? Okay, so lots more reading, more knowledge and progress. Silent reading, more common knowledge, keener awareness of known and unknown. Industrial Revolution, suddenly they figured out in America, they not only did they have a lot of trees, but they figured out how instead of taking the paper and printing a book, they could put it on a wheel and really crank it out fast. So it became cheap and bountiful. What's this thing, silent reading? So we talked about silent reading before, and forever it's been around, but people who could do it were few, far between, and weird. Suddenly, we began to expect that people do silent reading. It became the mode, the norm. I mean, even girls did it. So I'd just like to say that silent reading, if you look back across this, is not the product of any new insight or invention. It's historically and developmentally, silent reading arises only as a result of lots and lots of reading with understanding. Silent reading with comprehension depends on fluent understanding, automatic understanding of the words and the language and the information and the modes of thought. Reading once upon a time was not automatic for you. It's all of those things together. It sets up the whole circuit with the feedback nodes, right? It's not silent reading per se that's valuable, but the fluent understanding that underlies it. So what's happened as we've peeked into the head and developed these new things is we've greatly elaborated our model of what the reading, we used to have like 4 dots here, we had Wernicke's area and whatever, Wernicke's area, and now it's beginning to spread all over the place, and in fact, one of the things that's exciting right now, I mean, oops. So here's our little projection screen, and then it goes into the visual word form area, and then it spreads all over the place, and they can watch, they can see that when you're reading about biting an apple, the cells that move your mouth and respond to sour go off in your head. I mean, it's all over. So everything you know feeds your reading process. And as it's all tied together, one of the great breakthroughs of neuroscience is anything that goes one way goes the other. So whatever you learn, whatever you know feeds your reading, whatever you learn from reading feeds your knowledge. So, oops, that's the wrong button. So this is a graphic of what they're beginning to find with the new technologies of being able to look down deeper. There's this huge, it's not just these little things on our wrinkly cortex, there's this huge cable that goes underneath that connects everything fiscally and in parallel. What you understand is the handshake. We all vote for that. It's very democratic, you know, winner takes all. And so basically what you have now is that reading begins, this is a comparison on this side. What the guys did was they looked at spoken words in time. What happens to the activation of the brain as people watch spoken words? Most of the experiments are pretty simple right now. So these are just isolated spoken words, and you see that it turns on the temporal lobe, and then it spreads to the letter areas, and then eventually it spreads all over the language area. Here's written words. Nothing for the first 100 milliseconds. Then it does exactly the same thing. They become the same. Reading begins visually, and quickly becomes one with oral language. Oral language begins phonologically and quickly becomes one with the mind. So literacy depends on reading skill, writing skill, language skill, thinking skill, knowledge and experience. So we add to this, I wanted to add from the other one, the fact versus opinion and the knowledge awareness. That is, what do I know versus what do I think? What do I really, really know? Which I think is critical, because not only does that make you able to share knowledge hygienically with others, but also between your own thoughts, right? Which is really important. That's how you invent things. I need to keep these things straight, and then I can reuse them and see how they fit. You can share knowledge with yourself and think you can be an inventor then. So, wrong button. So there's my advanced organizer again. I guess it would be wrong to leave without finishing our little history. So we have the 20th century, which was very special. In the 20th century, we got universal schooling and began to understand that literacy was a fundamental human right. We also came up with the ideas of no letter instruction, no phonics instruction, no spelling instruction, silent reading only, no grammar instruction, and no word definitions. The kids should just infer the words, glean them from their reading with joy and comprehension. What were we thinking? What could be wrong with us? So, we're going to have to work this out and figure out, language is, because this is so complex, we could only do it if we're highly automatized. And it's because it's highly automatized that it requires all this fancy equipment to pick it apart and understand how we really do it. We're in a really lucky position now that we have those kinds of resources to begin to understand what's involved so that we can assist with its instruction and learning better, and probably its design. 21st century, we're now in the 21st century, and there is this issue of let's make print go away, because we can all have the screen and we can just listen. And I don't know how that will pan out, but I do think it's worth thinking about what's the net gain without reading. If reading is gone, then clearly the need for teaching phonics is gone, right? No problem. Visual word recognition and fluent silent reading is also gone. You just pull the scanner out on your cell phone and listen. Word form and pronunciation stability, like gorilla versus gorilla. I don't know. Those things are hard to hear, right? Vocabulary and precise, efficient semantic distinctions. I don't know, but it's not looking good, right? Syntax, logic, unambiguous descriptions of the relations between thoughts, I don't know. Differences in trueness, fact, opinion, certainty, simplification, generalization, model, projection, imagination. I don't know. Knowledge growth within and between individuals. I don't know. They won't, if right now there is no competition, no matter all the work we've done, if the goal is to learn, to have students learn, to have people learn, there is no medium that competes with written text right now. Okay? I have to say, but we're all looking at this with a very text-centric mentality, all of us in academics. That's what we do. Just as the ancients could never even imagine what written text would become, it was a crib sheet, right? It was for memorizing. It was for remembering stuff when you couldn't quite remember. A crib sheet. That's all it was, a tape recorder. They could never imagine how text would evolve, what it would give us in the way of cognitive affordances, in the way of knowledge extensions, in the way of communications, in the way of social extensions around the world. They couldn't guess. We can't imagine from here what the new electronic technologies, the forthcoming electronic technologies may offer. They may offer better ways of modeling knowledge, magical ways that are qualitatively different. But losing reading. For one thing, you can't design those things if you can't read and write, right? I mean, who's going to get these jobs? But also, losing reading seems a little bit risky. I think I, for one, am happy to continue to try to preserve it actively and make sure that my kids not just know how to read. I like books. I like comic books. I like all kinds of books, like newspaper, but also that they gain the perspectives and experiences and modes of thought that literacy affords. That's all I have to say. Did I have anything else? Oh, I want to give special acknowledgement to two people who warped my brain through their writing. Very strongly influenced me. One of them is Stanislaus Dehaene, from whom I took many of the neurological pictures, and the other, of course, is Dr. Olson here. World on Paper is such a beautiful book. I thank you.
That was wonderful.
Did I talk too long?
A little bit.
I'm sorry.
So you've had, how many, 6,000 or was it 8,000 years of literacy in about an hour and a half? So,
No,
60,000 years of literacy. So we're very grateful. That was a wonderful talk. I wonder if you'd entertain a question or two before you come from the platform. There's one right there. Stay at the... There's a microphone back there.
I have a very general question, and that's not a criticism, actually just a challenge. Would you be able to paint the same picture if you were to look at the development of reading in Amharic or Mandarin?
Would I be able to paint the same picture?
Especially as you move away from the cave drawings to...
The cave drawings.
Yeah.
Well, that's a really good question. I wouldn't want to answer it without jumping into my books. But I think, and the languages are very different, but there are also commonalities between them. So I think that the fact of writing things down for decontextualized understanding is a universal crisis that requires address, and it is from that we develop the means of disambiguating, the means of clarifying, and from those means of clarifying, it's because of those, because we developed this syntax for clarifying, this spelling for clarifying, that we were able to write about science and math and things we'd never seen before. That's my feeling. There is the phenomenon world around that an educated person learns to read differently, maybe with an accent, but they don't start with Dick and Jane, right? No, they don't. But you can, in their languages where people learn to read without learning to speak, too. So that's different. Yeah. I mean, there are languages which a second language person, like, for example, Chinese, like you can sort of choose. You want to learn to read or speak. Ooh. So, I don't know. I think that the business of insight, language is our bird song. It does come naturally. And as I say, automatic things are automatic because they're too complicated. We're able to do them because they're automatic, and because they're automatic, they're not available for us to scrutinize. And so writing gives us a palette. It gives us a worksheet in which we can write it, and having written it, can look at it. And that's very different. I think it's kind of magical. When Jane Ellen Huttenlocher's work on the syntax. I mean, it's just, or the syntactic priming stuff, it's magical. How quickly we learn, but we don't if we're not put in situations where we have to.
I think that's one of my questions is, and it's something that David and I argued many times, is that, I think the perspective, some aspects which you presented, I'm sure universal on the things that you're saying, but there may be some steps along the way which are maybe culture specific. So, for instance, if you look at the development and the study of the Talmud, which is done a lot of oral discussion there, right? Way before what you were saying is inversion, right? So
Totally.
It goes back almost 1,000 years ago.
Totally.
So I think we have to be careful about doing sort of a Eurocentric English, like sort of Greek.
This is very English-centric, and bear in mind that English was not a written language, except in the last couple hundred years, which is kind of nice for us, because we can look at it, the accelerated growth, where there was information from other cultures that we could not manage. So yeah, no, you're exactly right. And writing, though, was there for the Talmud too, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So any other question? I don't mean to be, I'm not trying to impose a culture on anything. I'm sorry. Okay. Yeah. No, definitely. There's huge differences between cultures. Now, the question of how those tie with their literacy history, we need a beer. I'd love to hear what you think. Yes. That would be very thoughtful. Thank you.
I was wondering whether you had an argument against this second orality, or whatever they called it, this ridiculous business of not reading or writing, on the grounds that if you stop a certain activity, the brain might suffer in certain ways. For example, I remember reading the brain that, what's it called, heals itself or creates itself. That cursive writing, for example, is very important because it's linked to graceful movements. That it's not just writing, the cursive writing, but it's also linked to how we move in space.
Oh, how interesting.
And if you say to children, well, you don't need to use cursive writing any longer, you're really endangering perhaps their movements. They'll fall from grace, so to speak. And I wonder whether, if you stop reading, it could affect your visual acuity, for example, and you then stop being able to do something that's been part of our evolution. So I just wondered whether you thought about that.
I just think these are really good questions. I do have to say, I don't want to scare you, but in addition to these very rich, very influential techies who asked me to write this report, I probably get about 2 emails a week from people saying that we can give up reading. Why are you still doing this? It's not needed anymore. So I'm figuring I'm getting the tip of the iceberg. I'm not that easy to find. But this is a real movement. Yes, and we need to pay serious attention to it. We can make school easier, we can make school better. Technology offers these ways, and it's time for us to start thinking about how to do that. Well, English is very difficult. Very difficult.
Right. But I thought that because of your position of power, and since you're on all of these councils and you have the government's ear, though, the government in the U.S. is, having
government
that
in
ear.
the U.S. is constituted entirely of geniuses. Did you watch our election?
Yes, I know. Okay. But I did very closely. I wonder whether you could people like you could make these arguments related to brain functioning.
Well, I think it's got to be a team sport. So let's go for it, okay?
Okay, I think we should stop now because it is getting, time is moving on. But we once again want to say thanks to Marilyn for a very interesting talk. Thank you.